can look like it's carved in, or it can look like it's carved out. You know, you can have a look at yourself. They're like optical stones. So I got it into my head then maybe they're kind of polarity stones. Maybe they're actually to help balance the building. You know, so that I'll come back to that later on. Basically, yeah, I started making them because I'd done a trip to Iona, and I went to Iona and I went to see the Sheela-Na-Gig on the Nuns Chapel, and it was heartbreaking. It's just a wet rock in the middle of the wall, and there's nothing nice about it. You can't see what it is. They're very hard to study, and I hated the way that Sheela-Na-Gigs, when you did go to the effort of seeing them, and that they can be, on a wet Irish day, they can be disappointing. You know, you can't see what they are, you can't see what the things are. And so that's when I decided, from working with Jack's book, most of my information did come from Jack's book. The rest of the soul, Jack Roberts died in 2023, just as I was picking up the mantle on the Sheela-Na-Gigs. Jack passed away. None of my work would have happened if it wasn't for Jack's book. So we're all standing on the shoulders of other people's work when it comes to the Sheela-Na-Gigs. But Jack, as you can see, Jack done a map, and he'd done them out there, and he marked them in, and he'd done all the drawings. And it's only when you were working on when you were reading Jack's book, that you realised that nearly a quarter of all the Sheela-Na-Gigs in Ireland were originally in Tipperary. I know most of them are up in the National Museums now, but there was close to 28 to 29 Sheela-Na-Gigs out of 122 that were mapped out in the 1850s were actually in Tipperary. And yet nobody raised the question or asked why. Why, if Ireland's the land of the Sheela-Na-Gigs, why was Tipperary the epicentre? You know, why did they all span out from there? So that's what had just my head cackling and going with things. And like that, I have one of these minds that I like knowing the answer to something. So I will actually turn around and spend 2 years making something to try and figure it out. It's just the way I'm wired. I don't expect anyone else to be. But it was only when I was working on the Tipperary ones that I stumbled upon, there's a lovely site, the Sheela-Na-Gig.org, that you can go on, and all the Sheela-Na-Gigs in Ireland are mapped out, and you can click on them, and it's a government initiative. And what caught me by surprise was basically during the Flan, the Go-Bon's gravestone was classed as a Sheela-Na-Gig. And I said to myself, well, that's strange, because like, why is the Go-Bon's gravestone? It's the only gravestone in Ireland that's classed as a Sheela-Na-Gig. And then, luckily enough, I live a stone's throw away from Go-Bon's Island. There in the Flan is Go-Bon's Island. Go-Bon's Island is where the Go-Bon Sayer was reputed to have grown up with his father. His father's name was Tuber Tragmar. He was the axe god of the Tuatha today, that whenever Ireland was being engulfed in a flood, that Tuber Tragmar would go to the nearest hill, he'd cast his axe, and the sea could not pass where his axe landed. So there was always a part of Ireland that was saved, no matter what storm was, because of the father of the Go-Bon Sayer. Now, in the 1920s, they turned around and they started calling the Go-Bon Sayer the church builder. You know, so you had Lady Gregory writing about the Go-Bon Sayer in the Penny Journal, and Lady Gregory's language on the Go-Bon Sayer was a little bit nasty. She said that he threatened his wife that he'd kill her if she had another female child, right? And you're looking at it going, that's not really the kind of energy that you think a king would have, or that a deity would have. But my reference to the Go-Bon Sayer comes from a different book. There was a lady called Ella Young, and she was an Irish immigrant. She went over to California in the 1920s, and she had an awful lot more freedom. Ella Young was in America, Lady Gregory was in Ireland. Ireland was only after gaining independence. It was after handing over the education and everything to the Roman Catholic Church. They were going to have to stop talking about the Irishness of religion, and they were going to have to kind of bring it down a bit. But as you can see, when Ella Young talks about the Go-Bon Sayer, she basically says the Go-Bon Sayer, whose other name was Manaman, whose other name was Cullion the Smith, was a great person long, long ago. He was the maker of worlds and the shaper of universes. Men said the stars were the sparks from his anvil. White horses were sacred to him, and Luke's white hound, the sun, knew him as a master. So that sounds a little bit more than a church building. You know what I mean? So you'd be looking at it that way. Now, the Sheela-Na-Gigs, as we know them, as Sheela-Na-Gigs, in the mid-1850s, 1840s, the English royal family, for whatever their curiosity, sent over an army of antiquity experts that spoke Irish to map out the stones in Ireland. You know, Cromwell had done the first ordnance survey maps between 1648 to 1660, but they had just put down stuff to divide the land. They had never actually looked into what it was that were on the buildings and who these people they were wiping out might have actually known. But in the 1850s, they had a curiosity to them and they sent them over. And it was actually in Tipperary that the first Sheela-Na-Gigs were actually discovered. There was two of the antiquity experts, Donovan and Coles. They were in correspondence with each other, and within a week of each other, they actually stumbled upon two different Sheela-Na-Gigs that were in Tipperary. Donovan, or Coles, was just a couple of fields away from my house. It was a castle called Mycarthy Castle, and yeah, that was the Sheela-Na-Gig that was on Mycarthy Castle. It was documented in the 1850s and it was missing by 1908, so that's the first time that one has been seen in the thing. The second one was Donovan. He found one that was in Rochestown, and all we have of them two Sheela-Na-Gigs are the 1850 sketch that the boys did of them. So that's why they're more female looking than a lot of the others, that all we have is a pencil drawing, so even when you're copying them you can only refer to their pencil drawing. But it started out from there, and even the Mycarthy Sheela-Na-Gig, they said that the locals had a name for her, and her name was Caitlin Owen. You know, so you go from Mycarthy Castle into Thurles. We had the Thurles Sheela-Na-Gig that was at Westgate. She was known as the Kylock on the wall, and then you had Caitlin Owen, and then you had the Gobond Sayre signed off his buildings with a two-tailed cat. The two-tailed cat was on Holy Cross Abbey, but that was moved into St. Bridget's graveyard in Thurles, where she resides now. She was the only two-tailed cat in the country that actually had a rat in her mouth. So right in the epicentre where I'm living, there was an awful lot of these. I didn't bring them with me tonight because they're made of clay, but I set out and I done the 28, 29 Tipperary ones out of clay. They'll be going up in Nina Public Library on Tuesday. They'll be up for 2 weeks there. So there's a bunch of the Tipperary ones that aren't here, but because they're hard to move and they're delicate, I didn't try fancy moving them twice in 1 week, to be honest with you. But so between I suppose we pull it back in a little bit. It's even funny that I'm here in Lorrha, because the very first church, Gobon's Island, I don't know if you're familiar with it. Everybody probably knows about the Dorrha-na-Flan chalice. Yeah, Dorrha-na-Flan chalice was found there by a couple of metal detectors, and it changed the way. None of us are allowed to use metal detectors now, because I took out it. But it was a hoard of 4 different centuries found beside the church that was on Dorrha-na-Flan. Dorrha-na-Flan was also known as Gobon's Island up until they found the chalice. But the very first church to go up on Gobon's Island was actually set up by your saint here, St. Rudolph. So about 8 years before St. Rudolph came to Lorrha, he actually built a church on Dorrha-na-Flan. But the funny thing about the date of the church that's on Dorrha-na-Flan is it was supposed to be built in 536 AD. Yeah, so 536 AD, put it into your phones when you leave here later on, press go on it, and you'll find out that 536 AD was the worst time in the world to ever be alive. That there was 9 years where nothing grew in the summers. Absolutely nothing grew. So it's hard not to see the link between, say, a pagan deity whose hill that you're sitting on, and then when the sun falls out of the sky and you can't see the moon, and there's a monk in the area, and he decides, we'll get your son back if we build a box, and we'll all come to him. And this first church was built. It's actually quite funny, because St. Rudolph didn't stay here very long. Yeah, St. Rudolph ended up moving up here to Lorrha, and lots of people would wonder why. But in the same length of time before St. Rudolph moved, we had another 5th century monk that was only a couple of miles across the bog from him, a fella called Mucquevogue. And Mucquevogue is in a place called Leithmore. And Mucquevogue set up his church just a couple of miles from the Gobans there after him. But he set up his church because his auntie had given him a bell. The bell would be muted till he found the point of his resurrection. And when he was walking through, after talking to the king of the Éile, he was walking through this area of land and his bell rang and he dropped to his knees because he knew he'd find the point of his resurrection. So I could see why one monk would say, right, I'm not going to leave my church here. I'll move on because God told you to put your church there. You know what I mean? So you got centered on because Mucquevogue's bell rang. You know what I mean? So all the history here. But it's the same thing. I think a lot of these go back past what you're talking about in the 10th and the 12th century. You'll even see in the talk of the Maicarchy one, that the Maicarchy Sheela-Na-Gig was taken off of a local church and placed onto the building of the new castle to bring it good luck. You know, so there was a phase where if you were building a building and you knew there was a Sheela-Na-Gig available to put onto your building, you thought it was a good idea to put it onto it. So that's where I kind of going back to them being kind of polarity stones, or that they were in the essence of the building. Personally, myself, I think the Gobán Saor might have been a person, might have been a deity, but it was definitely a school of thought. You know, that there was probably a school of master builders called the Gobán Saor. And the master builders on the castle were given the job to carve the stone that would help channel the energy of the building. So, yeah, basically you could see it like you have Dorrha here. There was one of the girls got in contact with me talking about her local Sheela-Na-Gig was being held captive by the OPW, so I decided to make a small version of it here. And, but the stone itself, like the Dorrha Glenworth Castle, Sheela-Na-Gig, she was found buried facing the wall in the cell of the castle, and she was probably buried for 200 years, taken back up now, and she's locked into an office. But you can see even with the shape of the stone, she was very wedge shaped. An awful lot of them are, and they also have a lot of carvings on the side of them, so it's almost like this is the stone that's going to hold the whole place together. Another one that kind of sticks out to me before I even start talking about what it would be the Kiltynan. The Kiltynan one, it's the castle that Andrew Lloyd Webber owns at the minute. She was found on the round building beside the castle. She was known as the guardian of the well. She was stuck to the well house. But when you go to remake her, when you turned around, you could see that right on her forehead, there seemed to be just two triangles touching each other. And yeah, one triangle looking up and the other triangle looking down, you know. So when I was looking at that, and like that, I've looked into loads of different religions and different beliefs and different schools of thought, and I had come across them symbols before, so I had to start looking into it a little bit more. But then I turned around and I had a look at the Wexford Sheela-Na-Gig, and the Wexford Sheela-Na-Gig is two triangles, one facing up and one facing down. But the funny thing about it is, you go to the Rock of Cashel, and the cat goddess is not a cat goddess anymore because she didn't have ribs, and her breasts were too big, and her face didn't look female enough. But this is still a Sheela-Na-Gig. So the school of thought of why one things aren't a Sheela-Na-Gig and then the other ones are, I still don't fully understand it. There's also a Sheela-Na-Gig on Castle Magner, and she's not a Sheela-Na-Gig anymore because both her arms are raised in the air. But she's the only Sheela-Na-Gig in the country with both her arms raised in the air. So there's a slight contradictions in what they say and how they define it. This symbol, I say myself, actually goes back to old school kind of Freemasonry or Hermeticism, where you basically, as above, so below, as within, so without, or it's basically that you put your attention in something bigger than yourself, that you believe there's something bigger than yourself, that you were put here for a purpose. You weren't just put here to buy a new car or get a handbag. You know, there was a reason for you to be here. Yeah, people used to think they had one. Yeah. And then you'd say to me, what are you talking about Freemasonry for? We're talking about Sheela-Na-Gig. And I can't understand. Everybody thinks Freemasonry is bad and dark and evil and all the posh people do it and all this kind of stuff about it. But the funny thing about the Freemasons is they are the oldest esoteric school still going today. You know, and their teachings are old. They're very old, and they're brought forward from generation and generation and generation. And there's a rumour, and it's probably tied into a lot of truth, that when the Templar Knights were disbanded, they took their work underground and they started the Freemasons. You know, and that's where it gets funny, because you turn around, and in Tipperary as well. Are you all familiar with Holy Cross Abbey?
Yes.
Yeah. Holy Cross Abbey was built by the Benedictines, and within 7 or 8 years of the Benedictines having Holy Cross Abbey, for some strange reason, they turned around and they gave it to the Cistercians. So one order gave this beautiful abbey to another order that they weren't really, you know, they were contrary to each other. They weren't like they would have been best friends or anything. But probably a good reason why the Benedictines gave Holy Cross Abbey away was because there's a little village 3 kilometres outside of Holy Cross, and King Henry II had granted the Templar Knights an 8,000-acre farm. So this area of Tipperary, and where most of these Sheela-Na-Gigs were actually found, actually fell under a Templar Knight stronghold. Yeah, and the Templar Knight farm in Tipperary, it was the Templars had 5 farms in Tipperary. They were all big landholdings, but the one in Clonoulty was the main financial hub. So when the Templars were there, they changed how farming was done. They brought in oxen, they mixed crops, they brought a lot of stuff from the continental side of Europe over to Ireland and taught us how to farm differently. But they were there, and they were there up until 1311, 1312, when the King of France decided, I don't want to pay him back, so let's call them all homosexual devil worshippers and kill them. You know, and that's what happened to Templars. Basically, somebody didn't want to pay him back, so he killed his creditors. You know what I mean? Yeah, we'd all would do it if we could. Did get away with it, would be the only thing. The only problem is, when they done it in France, it was they were put on trial and they were taken in and they were beaten and they were questioned and they were made to say that they were evil and they were put to death. In Ireland, it's fully documented. There's a talk on YouTube. There's a girl who does it there. It was one of the first ones back after, where they actually went through all the details of everything they know about the Templars in Clonoulty, and they list out all their holdings and everything about them. But in Ireland, basically they were told on Friday the 13th, 1312, arrest the Templars, put them on trial and kill them. But in Ireland, they brought them up to Dublin Castle and they put them on trial, and they couldn't find anything they'd done wrong. So they ended up just using it as a land grab. They took the Templars' land and they released them out with a state pension. So what's funny, small state pension, we'll take away 1,000 acres and here's the shekel. But it's funny how it goes, that all this can be there, and it's only when you actually see. And the reason why I know about the Clonoulty Templar thing is because basically in Clonoulty there's an old ruins of a church on a hill, and when a 200-year-old yew tree blew down, they found a Sheela-Na-Gig in the roots of the yew tree. Now she's in the Bolton Library in Cashel, but the Bolton Library is closed, but you can't see her in the window. You can see it, she's a rock. But she was her face had been hit with ploughs, and she's a badly damaged Sheela-Na-Gig, but she's still the Sheela-Na-Gig that lets you know that the Templars had her on their church. But then it's even funnier, because the Templars didn't have a church. The Templars had a thing called a preceptory. So the Sheela-Na-Gig was on the Templar preceptory. The reason why the Templars had a preceptory was because they were warriors from God, and they were willing to die on every breath. and they believed that when they struck out, they were to defeat evil. So from the minute a Templar woke up in the morning, he'd done a thing called Michaelic breathing. It was a breathing to the higher archangel Saint Michael, and it was basically inception and concept. So every breath had meaning, every breath had purpose. You were willing to die on every breath. And they also believed that we took a thing called ether off the periodic table around 1920, and that was the etric energy, the ether energy of God, the same thing that keeps us alive, that keeps us breathing. And the Templars believed that God was with them on every breath, But when you simplify that, like the only difference between living and being dead is breathing. So they weren't very wrong, you know what I mean? Yeah. But kind of science is nearly catching up with religion. My wife, she studies herbalism there, and I was reading one of her books on holidays during the year, and there's a book called Biology of Belief. Really good book, nice and easy read. But Bruce Lipton, basically he's a microbiologist. He starts into his career as an atheist. He had no belief in God, he had nothing about it, everything was a microscope, he was just looking down through everything. As he grew older, and as he watched how the human body grew, he said there had to be something divine. There had to be. There was too much in how the embryo develops for it not to be some kind of godly given gift. How them 50 trillion cells organize themselves, and you're standing there looking. But one of the biggest things that I took out of that book was our brains. Our brains, we have the blood-brain barrier, we have like brain cells, we have grey matter and embryonic fluid, and you think that's your brain. But there's one other part in your body that has grey matter, and it's your diaphragm, the lining of your stomach. So when you get that feeling that something's wrong, that's probably that little part of your brain in your stomach telling you something's wrong, And when you think about it, if the Templars were breathing in with conscious breathing, they were constantly feeding the bottom of their brain. They believed that there was something bigger than themselves. But what's funny about that symbolism that I was talking about there is that's the one that we found on the Kiltenan Sheela. It's one triangle looking up at the other triangle. There's a 4-part to this, and there's only one crowd of people I know that's actually using this still today, and unfortunately their names are Freemasons. But the thing about Freemasonry is that you can be any religion and be a Freemason. And the reason why you can be any religion and be a Freemason is because all religions can tie their belief system back to this thing called, the Golden Staircase, or the House of the Holy, or whatever way you like to see it. But it's basically 4 stages. It could be microcosm, macrocosm, believing in something bigger than yourself, understanding it, getting the understanding of this. And when you get the understanding of this, you're in perfect harmony. And when you get your vibration into perfect harmony, you understand that you have a spark of God within yourself, that there's one piece. Now, that has been used in systematic high magic, it's been used in Freemasonry, it's been used in Hermeticism. And when you turn around to the Sheela-Na-Gigs, and you go to Clonmacnoise, in the cloisters in the nuns' chapel, what do you find in the centre of it? It's the second one. So the nuns had the greater understanding. It's there, Then you turn around and you go to, say, Ballyfinboy, and you can nearly see the star coming into her, basically, mysticism wasn't illegal back then. You know what I mean? It was over time. The Roman Catholic Church basically started closing back in on what you could believe in. And mysticism, when the Templars were first formed, they were formed by a medieval mystic called Bernard de Clairvaux. Now you can look into Bernard de Clairvaux. He's very, very well documented. There's loads of beautiful books on his medieval mysticism. And when Bernard gave the Templars their prayer paths to go to the Holy Land and everything else and what he was telling them to do, in 1100 that was okay. And then by 1312, because the Templars still had the same beliefs, they were evil. So you can see how things started to change over, and basically they closed down on what belief was allowed to be. And as you can see as well, it's kind of, a lot of different religions had their own versions of the Tree of Life. You know, you had your Nordic ones, you had your Assyrian ones, and you had your mystic Kabbalah. And there's certain times when you look, if you look at Sir Kiran, she has these very purposeful, like 6 holes, you know. They say the things that are on it there. The same thing, Ballyfin Bay again, if you look at that, each point, she has the actual Assyrian Tree of Life carved into her. So I'd say with some schools of thought, or with some of the builders, they were definitely trying to tie in some kind of mysticism into stone to get the balance, you know. But even when you look at Ballinderry, that's like a 5th century, it's 15th century. It's probably one of the latest of them all. But Ballinderry had like your 2 streams of energy. She had your flower of life, she had the rose, and even the other symbols that when you look at it now, it's like the birth of a nucleus. Yeah, like religion to us in general, it basically has been dumbed down. I don't know if you're familiar with like what they consider to be the original teachings of Jesus. There's a book called the Nag Hammadi Library. Are you familiar with the Nag Hammadi Library? The Nag Hammadi Library, they call it a thing kind of like Gnosticism. Whether it was one school of thought or whether it wasn't, it was basically, these people were very, very intelligent and they were very intellectual. There was a beautiful poem, you'll find it on YouTube there, it's called Thunder, the Perfect Mind. It's probably the first time that you see a positive and a negative in a female direction of trying to define what the sacred feminine was, you know. And basically their belief systems and where we went to and what was happening was a hell of a lot more than just purgatory, heaven and hell. You know, they had a direction, they had the creators, the other creators, the Sophias, the Yaldabaoths. They had an awful range of very in-depth and complicated ways that they seen we were going to get our ascension. And that was basically stepped down and made easier and easier because of the spread of religion across Europe. Like what a lot of people don't realize is even the Jesus cult died, you know, within a couple of years of Jesus. And then we had St. Paul that got visited by Jesus 100 years after Jesus died. But even Paul to the Corinthians teachings, when he was, that was the first time that the teachings were going outside of kind of the Abrahamic religions. He was the first person to actually teach the Gentiles. But the religion that we actually follow, there was a prophet 300 years after Jesus, a prophet called Mani, and it was Manichaeism that was what spread across Europe like wildfire. Within 12 years after Manichaeism, like 80% of Europe had turned from being Zoroastrian and Jewish to Hebrew, and it was just all about it was all about Christianity. But the problem was, it was Christianities. There was no set division for what it actually was. And that's when they started stepping down on what people's beliefs were. So even the first Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, that was just to define the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So like you had 280 bishops arguing for a week about how are we going to word Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And they ended up doing it as in the Father is not, and the Son is not, and the God is not, but they are in together, you know. And this is even one of their the order. Can't find it. The order. There's one of the Sheela-Na-Gigs is from one of these very earlier orders that was still prevalent in Ireland at the time. I reckon myself, when you think about the way the time was, when it was all 5th century monks that were, 6th century monks in the 500s that were coming over to us, they would have been the teachings of Manichaeism. They wouldn't have been what was stripped down and what was being told by Constantine and by the bishops of what it was. So we would have had much more kind of Gnostic monks. We would have had bigger teachings of what Jesus was actually teaching people to do. And from what the Nag Hammadi Library basically tells us was that Jesus was teaching us to get to be able to meditate within inside ourselves and to be able to go up to the tree, up to the noose, up to the light, and actually come back down with the divine knowledge. And seemingly there was only 2 of the apostles that could actually do that with Jesus. The rest of them could go up so high and they'd fall back down without hitting the light and getting the thing on it. And the 2 apostles that could get to the light were Mary Magdalene and Judas. We all know what happened there. You know what I mean? So when you actually see what the teachings are, and the Nag Hammadi Library, we've only had it since 1945. It was basically found in a crypt of a cave by a fella called Muhammad Ali. I know it sounds, he was the original Muhammad Ali, but Muhammad Ali basically found this crypt, found a load of containers, and when he brought them home thinking they were full of gold, they were full of Coptic writing, and he ended up going to the next village and avenging his father's death and eating your man's heart, and he got locked up a little while for eating your man's heart. When he came back out, his mother-in-law had burnt all the books. Yeah, and there was only one vessel left, and that's what we have as the Nag Hammadi Library. So there was ancient teachings from the 1st to the 3rd century that were burnt to bake bread in 1945. Right? So you could see how information gets lost all the time and how different things go. What was in them other books, what was in them, we don't know, we never will know. But like that, they were probably hidden in that cave in Nag Hammadi because of one of the councils of Nicaea, or one of the things where all of a sudden it was illegal or it was heretic to have these books. So they were teaching you what you were allowed to teach, and they were scaling you back on what you weren't. But yeah, I suppose I go back towards the Go-Bon Seir, and I'll talk to you a little bit about him. Yeah, because as I said, to me, the Go-Bon Seir is defined best in Ella Young's book. He's not just building churches, he's building fortresses for Balor the One Eye. He's doing an awful lot of stuff that was written out of him in the 1920s. But what was important to me was that it was still written today that the Go-Bon signed off his building with a 2-tailed cat. But see, then you go to the bishop's house on the Rock of Cashel, and you had the cat goddess. And you weren't allowed, well, the cat goddess was on the outside of the bishop's house, and nobody could enter the bishop's house while holding ill intent. So you could not pass by her and actually have an evil thought. Right? No, you couldn't walk into his house, you couldn't think a bad thought about him. But you could see merely in the carving that she could bring in the negative stream of energy into the mind, body, spirit, back to the Godhead, back to the material plane, and back down, and spread it back out as positive energy. So she's probably the most obvious of the fact that she was able to channel energy of all the Sheela-Na-Gigs, and yet she's the one that's not allowed to be called the Sheela-Na-Gig anymore. No. But as I was saying, even Irish history is so questionable. You know, you look at the Rock of Cashel and they tell us, you know, Brian Brew built it and his grandson gave it away to the church because there was a Danish king telling him he had to. and they have the dates of it being built. But we have, back to Pádraig O'Riordan, when Pádraig O'Riordan, he translated a 12th century Latin manuscript that was written in Roscrea Abbey, another kind of Cistercian abbey, and 2/3 of that manuscript was written about the monk called Mucquevogue, which was originally set up in Leadmore, just a couple of miles away from Dorrha. But Mucquevogue made Jesus look like an amateur. Right, he did. Like, Jesus only done his first miracles after the age of 30. Mucquevogue's mother's breast milk was curing blindness. Right, she had to just squirt her breast milk in blind men eyes because she had Mucquevogue in her belly. You know, you can't get much more potent than your fetus is curing blindness in other people. Right, you just can't. And it's the same thing. The stories in Mucquevogue, if he fell out with you or if you were doing something wrong, he was... if you didn't own up to it, and he basically said, by the sun goes down, whoever did that, your eyes are going to fall out. And yeah, then some lad's walking down the street later on and his eyes fall out. You know, so like this monk had power. He had power and he had the ability to use it. Even the king of the Airlag changed and wanted to come back and kick Mucquevogue off his abbey, and he stormed into the place with an army of men to kill all the monks. And when he jumped off his horse, he couldn't move, and his feet were stuck to the ground. And he called his men back, and they all started to pull out, and they couldn't get it. And they tied a horse to him, and they couldn't get it to move. And it wasn't until he admitted to Mucquevogue that he wasn't going to kill him that he was released from the land. You know, so like, you can call these things stories, or you can say, was the Gnostic monks actually that powerful? Is this the reason why they were trying to wipe them out? And I do think, if you think about it in a sense, if you're banning a religious order on the mainland of Europe, and these people have a connection, and these people are doing good, they're going to stay moving and moving and moving. And the furthest place that they could get to was Ireland. You know, at the time, it was the place where they were. And when you look at Irish history, it nearly spells it out to you. You know, how many invasions did we have? You know, we had the Vikings coming, but they settled in with us and everything was fine. Then the Normans came back, but then after the Normans came back, they had to send back Strongbow. And then after Strongbow done that, it still wasn't good enough. If you actually look, there's a book from the 16th to the 17th century where the English Queen, it's called Irish Priest Hunters, right? And it was in the 16th to the 17th century. So even after Cromwell, if you were in England, you were after murdering someone or robbing somebody's horse, you could go to the Tower of London, I will give you money on a horse, and you go to Ireland and kill priests for us. And there's a book written with 9 of the most vicious priest killers that they could come up with. And these boys were going through Ireland, but they weren't killing every priest. They could sit down in the town for months. They could see what a priest was doing. And it wasn't until they heard about a certain type of priest that they went in and they killed that priest. So they seem to be kind of killing a belief system in Ireland throughout the ages, throughout time. And they were still doing it up into the 16th, 17th century after all these were being carved. You know, so, where was that? Yeah. But yeah, in my theory, that I think myself, with the go-bonds there and the signing it off with a cat, then there being, basically the cat goddess is the essence of it, of a two-tailed cat. I'd say that was the start of the balancing stones for the buildings. Next thing, when there was a new go-bon or there was a go-bon on a building, it was his job to do the next balancing stone. You know, when you look at the Sheela-Na-Gigs, there's 120 of them in Ireland, ranging from the bottom of Cork to the top of Donegal, and yet not 2 of them are the same. They're not even close to the same. So, if you were to be copying a deity, surely you'd be drawing the deity the same way, you know. But if you were given the job to make a female balancing stone for the building as an apology to the female powers of the earth and the regenerative powers of growth, because we've pulled out all these rocks, we've changed the landscape, we've destroyed what was perfect to turn it into something purposeful for ourselves. They had to balance the energy of creation. And my theory is that's pretty much what she was. You know, even when you look at Newtown Lennon, Newtown Lennon is a church, but it was built as a fortress. It was thrown together. It was a Norman invasion happened. Normans came into part of Tipperary. They were claiming this part of the land, and they just put walls around their horses and they put things there and they were holding it down. And their Sheela-Na-Gig was probably one of the quickest carved round stone Sheela-Na-Gigs in the country, you know. Yeah, to bring it back to it being the female power stone that you all have heard and dreamt and thought that it was to be, she probably is, and that is the truth of it. But in the sense of, if you go to earlier belief systems, there's a brilliant book called The Worship of the Regenerative Powers by Thomas Wright. You'll get it as an audiobook on YouTube as well. And basically, Thomas Wright wrote that book shortly after the Sheela-Na-Gigs were actually documented and released in England, and he has some amazing information in it and some amazing history of what things were and what people did believe. Like the Roman Empire in general, they had loads of little phalluses on their children. They'd make these little silver and gold penis charms, and they'd leave them beside children to keep them healthy and to keep them safe, because they reckoned that the phallus was the sun's energy coming down that called the seeds up out of the ground. So the regenerative powers of the earth was that the earth was impregnated with God, and it wasn't until the beams of God's light came down onto the pregnant earth that was full of the female power that they could actually pull themselves up and generate themselves out of it. And when you look at the Goban stone, when you actually look at it, if this was the sun and the god and they were the four archangels or your four seasons or whichever it was, and then this is the rays of the light down into the ground, pulling back up the growth. You know, some of the symbolism is easy to see in some of the things, and sometimes it isn't. You know, I think what else can we talk about? Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting even what other people will send you on. You know, I haven't been to Borisbeg. I keep meaning to go. It's only outside of Nina. But if I go to Borisbeg now, there's nothing there. There's a church and a few headstones, and the Sheela-Na-Gigs are gone. You know, and some people, I always thought there was two of them in Borisbeg, but a fella, Dorrha, he has a cool Facebook page called Tipperary Antiquity. Dorrha was in contact with me a few times, and he sent me on a few different links. And one of them was lovely. It was basically that this Sheela-Na-Gig here had been gifted to the local priest, and the priest was writing back to the county council saying, "Thanks so much for another opportunity to study one of these beautiful essay stones." And when I see the word essay stone, I said, that's actually probably one of the best descriptions I've seen for a Sheela-Na-Gig. But the reason why he was gifted that Sheela-Na-Gig was because the Irish government at the time was starting to make roads. And they had told the county council, we want to put a proper road on that cow track going that way there. So if there's any surplus castles or churches, we want you to take down the stones and lay them on the road going this way. And seemingly the council worker came back to the council boys one of the days after he told them, see that church, put it in the ground and put it that way. And they were all sitting around one stone and they were refusing to put her in the road. Yeah, so even back then, the people themselves just wouldn't mess with the Sheela-Na-Gig, but the thing was on it. But just to think of how much history we actually lost around the country just from making roads, and how many people didn't care about putting the Sheela-Na-Gig into the road. You know, there was probably one lad on that workforce that was a little bit superstitious, that wouldn't let anything happen. But yeah.
Have you a theory on why she's not so pretty?
Sorry?
Have you a theory on why she's not so pretty.
The Sheela-Na-Gig in general. Yeah, well, she's both the ugliest Sheela-Na-Gig in the country. Yeah, the feathered one on the wall. And it was funny because even when I was working on that one, she had this purposely broken leg with her foot twisted backwards, you know, and it's carved into the stone. I was only down there the other day looking at it, and it still is very evident. But it's like that, like your man said, the essay stones, you can turn around and you can work on some of them and they can give you a feeling that it's something completely different. And when I was working on her, I'm not too sure if you're familiar with a thing called, say, have you ever heard of anyone with like the gift? Have you heard of the gift?
Yeah.
You know, if you're lucky enough on somebody's deathbed, they'll pass you on the gift. Now, I've tattooed a fella who told me he had a really bad cut, and a fella on the job came up and said to him, I can make that stop bleeding for you if you like. And your man said, what do you mean? He says, I don't even have to touch it, but if you want me, I can do it. And he didn't touch him, he just concentrated, and your man's cut stopped bleeding. And he hunted him down on that building site that day, and like, what did you do? It still hasn't opened up. And he said, on his father's deathbed, his father passed him on the gift, and he can't stop bleeding. Yeah, why this young lad was working on a building site and not in an ambulance, I don't know. That's something that's another question for another day. But when I was carving this one with the broken leg, you would wonder if there was a little hidden symbol that there was a gift of a bone setter, a gift of a healer within Feather town walls. And if you understood the language of the Masons, if you could see it, you'd go, oh, I have a broken leg, I'll pop into Feather. You know, and there could be, there's so many of them things hidden, and there's so many different ways of looking at them. And like, as you can see, they're all so different. You know, if you think about Sheela-Na-Gigs, or if they talk about them, it always goes to that French one that just has a big massive vulva and a small head. And everybody thinks Sheela-Na-Gigs are just about female genitalia. But when you actually break them down and start looking at them in the shape, there's definitely something more to them than anything else, you know. Even the Colin Vogue in County Offaly, she was found under a bridge, in the water, with the water just going clean over her. You know, so somebody at some stage, and there's not a church to be found anywhere there, you know. Now maybe the church not found because there was a road there, and there was one stone that they didn't want to throw into it, I don't know, but I do. But then you'd question yourself, was the river polluted? Did something happen in the river? Were people drinking from the river and getting sick? And somebody decided, I'm going to have to fix the river. I'm going to put a Sheela-Na-Gig under the bridge, and then all the water that passes over her will be fine. You know, and you go to, and then there's so many of these that are still even missing when it comes down to it. Like you had the Kiltanan one went missing there beside the thing only in 1990. You had the other ones missing before 1908. Like, we are slowly losing them, and we're losing them from theft, we're losing them from erosion, we're losing them to warehouses in museums, and then the museums have such fancy looking things, they have no interest